truth that he's talking about in this whole passage is the truth that he has spoken about himself. That he's of God, that he's the light of the world. It's in me, he says, that you will be made free. The truth that makes us free is Jesus' own self. It's that in Jesus we see God. Jesus is saying when we grasp this truth, we're no longer slaves to sins. In him we become children of God, free indeed. That's the truth, the only truth he's talking about here. His truth. The truth that he's from God, you shall know, and it will make you free. In Montgomery, Alabama, in the center of the city, kind of downtown, not far from the visitor center, right over there, down the hill from the state capitol, gleaming white in the sunshine, there's a fountain, a big fountain with kind of a fence around the outside of it, that is maybe 15 yards across. It's decorated with figures from Greek mythology. When I was there, it was empty. You can see the base of it, but it should be sparkling with blue, burbling water. And at that spot, dark-skinned human beings used to be bought and sold. It was one of the most active auction sites in our nation, especially in the last 20 to 30 years of the slave trade. I was there in October. Many of you know I have its renewal week for the month of October, and I spent about a week in Montgomery and Selma and Birmingham in that area. And I stood there that day thinking, I've never been that close before, standing where people, persons, human beings were bought and sold. And then, 3 days later, I'm standing at the Legacy Museum, this amazing museum, which I highly recommend, there in Montgomery. And I learned the truth I hadn't really grasped, how broad the trade was in enslaved persons. In practically every port city on the eastern seaboard, and not just on the ports, but on into this inland. So it happened in, like actively in places that I had been, like Richmond and New Orleans, and places that I haven't been, but I know a lot of people who visited these cities, Savannah and Charleston. Charleston was the most active port, reportedly, for enslaved persons coming into the country. And it wasn't just the South. It went all the way into the North. In New York City, there was a slave auction site very active on Wall Street. Anybody visited Wall Street? The first time I ever visited New York City, I was on Wall Street. And in Boston, I lived 3 years in Boston. Never thought about Boston as a place where there was slave trade. But Faneuil Hall, which is part of the Freedom Trail, and Boston is huge in the American Revolution. There's a lot of sites there. Faneuil Hall was a place where the slave trade happened. Right there where we bought trinkets and, ate out in this little plaza area. There were all the major cities in the North had slave auction areas. In Rhode Island and Connecticut, all the way up to New Hampshire. There are other cities like St. Augustine, is it Augustine or Augustine? I don't know how they say it, Florida. Big slave auction site there. And inland as close as St. Louis. Never would have thought about St. Louis as a place that slaves were brought and then sold. I had definitely stood before October in some of those places where enslaved persons were auctioned like livestock, where there would have been wailing, right? As families were separated, as a mother's daughter or son was ripped from her arms and sold away from her, or a husband and a wife, people who had ties of love and even children would have been torn apart, where purchasers would come and probe their mouths and other parts of their body to see if they were fit, like they would a horse, where their entire being was boiled down to the economic value they could bring to the person who might buy them. Human life reduced to financial terms, to produce wealth, in terms of labor, or to produce a different kind of wealth and a different kind of labor through women's bodies that were used to reproduce and add to the herd, one might say. I never saw any of that highlighted in any of the tourism promotions in any of those places that I visited or heard about. And I wonder, could knowing the truth of these places make us more free? Would you pray with me? Holy and gracious God, you invite us into Lent and you tell us that we will come to Easter and there will be resurrection. In this season, we're thinking about liberation and freedom, and we wonder how all this fits together. As we make this journey, we would ask that you would open our hearts and minds to what you would want us to know and see the questions that you want us to ask, the scriptures you want us to wrestle with. We would ask that the words that I say and the meditations of every one of our hearts would be acceptable in your sight. Oh God, you are our rock and our Redeemer. Amen. So here we are really just starting the season of Lent, started on Ash Wednesday. This season, but that, as I said, does lead us up to Easter and prepare us. I always think of it as preparing us to more fully accept that amazing gift of resurrection and new life. Like, what if some of the things that keep us from new life would fall away as we prepare for that day to come? Lent this year includes for us the invitation to journey together on this seeking of liberation. And so we have this book, Lent of Liberation. There's a few copies back there yet. You're welcome to pick one up and join in. There's 40 devotions, 41 for every day of Lent. When you're counting the days of Lent, you don't count Sundays, so you don't read anything, or you don't need to on Sunday. And we will be having Sunday school time at 10:30 on Sunday to talk about this book. And also on Tuesday, there's a group, really through our Equity and Justice group, meeting at 11:30 in the fellowship hall. I don't mean it's just them, I mean they're bringing the soup, at least for this first week. And so we'd love to include anybody who could come that day in a larger conversation than just the folks who've been part of that group up to now. As we think about this, it's this we're journeying together around a specific set of questions and a specific focus is really in line with our Christian tradition, where people gathered as a church to fast and to pray and to name and to lament and to turn and to see what they hadn't known before. So the work that we're inviting all of us to do together this Lent centers on the history of slavery and issues around racism, but this question of freedom can go in a lot of directions. Like, what are the other things that we shy away from looking at? On Wednesday, I mentioned we're probably going to talk a little bit about things like Israel and Hamas and all the fighting that's happening there in Gaza, and climate change, and immigration, criminal justice is another area. There's probably many more. Where are you bound by maybe not wanting to know the truth, or not having taken the time to think about where the truth is? Sometimes that comes out of a fear of what we might learn, of what we might have to do or be differently if we did look. My friend Cindy reminded me this week, we were chatting about this scripture, and she said, the most common phrase when people come into the presence of Jesus or an angel or anything in the Gospels is, you know what I'm going to say? Do not be afraid. Do not be afraid. The starting place is, do not fear. That's part of breaking this bondage that we seek to break in this season. So as we begin, I want to invite you to consider this question. What do you remember learning in school or from your community about the origins of the U.S. and the institution of slavery? Actually, I want you not to just think about this in your heads, but to partner up and find someone to talk to about this. Like 2s or 3s, pair up with somebody, and we're going to just take a little time and have this conversation. Joyce is going to give us some music. Extra points if you talk to somebody you didn't come with. And if you're on the live stream, this is a conversation I hope you'll have if there's someone else in the spaces where you are. Or get onto the comments on YouTube or interact with us through the valleyofc.org contact page. We'd love to include you in this conversation. So just find somebody, don't look around and make sure no one's left out, and let's have that conversation for a few minutes on this question. What do you remember learning about this subject? Go. Question for you to kind of continue your conversation. So the next question is, what have you had to revise of what you learned growing up? Or maybe what you didn't get taught growing up? Like, what was a surprise when you learned it? I've heard some of you talking about, well, I didn't really get taught anything. So what have you learned that has surprised you about this history of our nation around slavery and racism? Okay, continue your conversations. I'm just wondering the listener. All right, 30 seconds, and then we'll come back together. If you could, stay where you are, because we're going to do this again. Thank you for being willing to have that conversation. I've heard it said that what many Americans have been taught about slavery or have sort of figured out, like, again, I heard some of you say, well, I wasn't really taught very much at all. But kind of the way we tell this story in our head is something like, well, slavery was a thing in the South, and it ended with the Emancipation Proclamation, which I'm sure we learned about in civics or some kind of history class. And that was around the time of the Civil War. And for a long time we had segregation, which was like separate but equal. A lot of people could say that. And then Rosa Parks sat down on a bus because she was tired, and Martin Luther King had a dream, and the civil rights movement took care of everything else. That might have been not quite what we were taught, or certainly it wouldn't have been all of it. It's not too far off from the way a lot of people have remembered this history, although I do think it's grown more nuanced in more recent years as we've begun, I think, in some ways to grapple with this history. I know that I absorbed a little more nuanced history than that caricature, and I've read and learned a lot since then. But the fact that I could go to the Legacy Museum in Montgomery in October and be amazed by maps that demonstrated how broad that slave trade was, how there were enslaved people in the northern states well into the 1700s. Slave ships bringing people who became enslaved, came into those seaports through 1808. And it was really after that international trade was cut off. 1808 was the compromise that was reached between the northern and southern states to end that slave trade. It was after the international trade ended that a lot of the presence of slavery got concentrated in the South. Huge numbers of huge increases in those numbers. But I clearly had got into this narrative that is, this whole issue of slavery is about the South. And that happened to be kind of convenient because my entire family history is from the North, right? Like, we've done a lot of genealogy. I know where my people came from, New England and New York and Ireland and all that. My family came through the good part of the country when you start thinking about this supposed history. And it's easy to think that we Northerners, like, I think we probably said this in my school classroom growing up. There was some sense of, well, it's a mess down there, but at least we're in the North and we weren't part of it. But that was one of my answers to these questions. I was taught that slavery, or I learned somehow, I thought that slavery was a Southern issue. And now I know it was way bigger than that. And it's not just the auctions, the trading of enslaved people, it's how the economics of the North were so deeply intertwined with the institution, the economics of slavery. So large amounts of wealth in the North came from cotton that was grown on those plantations through the work of enslaved people. But the products of that flow to the north, where a lot of the wealth was built on textile mills that were located there. And then the shipping industry that took those textiles across the ocean, that was boosted by the presence of all this cotton fabric that was allowed to happen at all because of the economics of what happened there. In recent years, you may have seen some of these reports of New York financial institutions realizing that on their books they have policies from way back then that ensured the life of enslaved persons for the owners of them, right? Not their lives the way we might have life insurance today. Or where enslaved persons were collateral for loans or other financial instruments that enabled credit to be extended to people who were trading in those bodies. It can be said that if there's old money anywhere in the United States, that it's linked to slavery. And it's pretty hard to unwind all those threads and say, oh, that was them, but we're not part of that. So my elementary school belief that this was just a Southern thing, it's just plain wrong. Another thing, it's way clearer to me today than in school that the civil rights movement did not take care of all this. Did anybody else have to learn that somewhere along the way? I think I've always known at some level that we weren't done with these issues, that there's still inequities that need to be fixed. But I used to think it was just a matter of time. Because everyone knew, everyone agreed that we needed to get there. We agreed on the rightness of removing these racist and discriminatory policies, but we kind of knew that it would also take some time to iron all that out. So when we see these things that are not right, it's just an example of where, well, we just haven't gotten to that yet. With all the readings and conversations and learnings that we've done with our equity and justice group, we didn't call ourselves that the whole 4 years we've been meeting, but this group that comes together every couple of weeks and we read and talk together, I no longer believe that that's the truth of all this. Racism persists, not because someone messed up and hasn't fixed it yet. This is Ibram Kendi taught me this. Racism persists because some people benefit from the status quo, and others fear that they'll be harmed if that changes. Isabel Wilkerson helpfully offered the paradigm of caste. You know, C-A-S-T-E, what we know from India, right? There's this caste system in India. Isabel Wilkerson was the first to say, you know what, when you look at the issue of race in the United States, it's better described as a caste system. And her book, Caste, lays that out. There's a movie that just came out called Origins, which is a wonderful sort of introduction to this work. It's a heavy and hard work, but it's well worth it. And this is a quote where she talks about like how this works. It's insidious and powerful, and it's not about hatred, really. It's about the ways that we've learned to be in the world, the kinds of patterns of behavior that have been instilled in us about, you read a lot of books that come from African American sources, especially in the South, where, because the South are bad people, where you couldn't be, a black person to look a white person in the eye would be a hanging offense. And you just knew you wouldn't do that, or to speak back, or to use their name, or something other than sir or ma'am would not be safe in that place. Those are evidences of caste that have a whole lot more to do with these practices than they do about any specific difference in skin color. These authors point out that most of us in the room who are part of the dominant caste, that's Isabel Wilkerson's language, we let this be true because we don't trust the possibility of an alternative, and because we, people who look like us, are happy for there to be someone lower down on the ladder, because, well, probably none of us ever reach the top, but as long as we're not at the bottom, we don't feel quite so bad about ourselves. That's a pretty harsh description of a lot of us, and we probably don't quite recognize it, but she makes a really good case that it's built into the politics of this. Heather McGee and the Sum of Us makes a case that we make a terrible bargain in this way. We all pay a price for the continued inequities in our culture, but we can't seem to believe that there's anything other than a zero-sum game around this. In other words, that if we give something up, if they're going to benefit, the people who are now kind of hurt by discrimination, that if we fix that, that we will be disadvantaged, we who've been dominant and benefited from it. And she says we get that wrong over and over again. Okay, so I've said a lot here, and I want to kick it back to you just for a moment of further conversation. So I've given you a couple of examples where I thought I knew some of these things about racism and our history, and I found that I was wrong around who's responsible and where that responsibility lies, and about whether it's been resolved already. Talk to the people you were with before. Does any of this resonate? Does it spark some other thought that you want to share? Places where you've had to revise what you thought was true. I'm just going to give you another minute or so. Go. One more question. As we come back together, wrap it up. Okay, 34 seconds. As we come back together, I want you just to think about this question, and we don't have time to talk about it today. But I wonder if any of you have come to this question of, well, if we talk about what is true, what is true? I feel like I know more today than I used to, but I also know there are different sides to every story. And there's people who have come from a different perspective that would disagree with a lot of what I've read and have been shaped by in my thinking about this. Somebody told me that Anti-Racist Baby is on the banned book list. We're going to see why it's so dangerous. I don't know, because we're naming that there are colors. I don't know. All right. Anyway, but we could. Feels like it's hard to talk about some of these questions of truth in a culture that we talk about fake news and we call each other out over and over again. We could talk for a long time about that question, but I want us to come back to our scripture where Jesus seems absolutely clear on the truth and the effect of it, but he wasn't actually talking about all the truths. Let's look at what he said. Jesus did not say that knowing truth in general will make you free. He didn't say here, go out and seek to know all the truth you can, sort out the false from the true, get it right, and then you'll be free. He said something quite a bit simpler than even all of these books are trying to talk about, let alone all the books about all the knowledge and science and history and philosophy and all the other branches of knowledge. He wasn't talking about all the truths here. He said something about a very particular truth and a very specific way to know it. Do you see it? He says something about how we can know the truth, which is continue in my word and be my disciples. And then he says, what's that truth? You will know the truth, and the truth will make you free, which comes again to that question of what truth. To really delve into this, we have to spend time, and we can do this at the 10:30 gathering if you want to delve into this. John 8 is a whole chapter of discussion that he's talking about sort of the truth with the Jews that were part of the Jewish establishment in Jerusalem. And so he says these words in the middle of this long argument, the whole book of John 8. You can go back and read it, you can see what I mean. But the argument is about whether he, Jesus, is who he says he is. Whether he's actually from the Father, whether he's of God. So this argument with the Jews, who are kind of the powerful Jews, they say, we're descendants of Abraham. Abraham being the patriarch way back in the book of Genesis, way back early in the Bible. That's kind of the identity that the Jewish people had through time. They are essentially saying, we're descendants of Abraham, that's all we need, we're good with God. In the midst of Jesus laying out these core things that are true about him, which includes, in essence, that you might have used to been able to stand just on Abraham, but now that I'm on the scene, you can't do that if you reject me, Jesus. Which means the truth that he's talking about in this whole passage is the truth that he has spoken about himself. That he's of God, that he's the light of the world. It's in me, he says, that you will be made free. The truth that makes us free is Jesus' own self. It's that in Jesus we see God. Jesus is saying when we grasp this truth, we're no longer slaves to sins. In him we become children of God, free indeed. That's the truth, the only truth he's talking about here. His truth, the truth that he's from God. You shall know, and it will make you free. We have to be really careful with this because John chapter 8 is one of the parts of the Bible that people use to support anti-Semitic reaction to Jews, to fight the Jews or destroy them or push them away. It's true, Jesus is presenting his truth, and the conversation gets a little raw, but it's a discussion, a kind of a dispute, a challenge. And it's really, we see this over and over again through Jewish tradition. And it's not at all in that moment like it's between enemies. It's more like a conversation among relatives. You ever had a conversation with relatives that someone who's not part of the group might listen in on, or if they overhear it, they might think, oh my gosh, those people really hate each other. Anybody know what that's like? Like, we can be a little bit free in the way we talk to people we're close to. This is like that. It's pretty rough. But nowhere does Jesus say or imply, and therefore hate the Jews. Don't ever mistake what Jesus says as reason to blame or hate the Jews or any other religion, Muslim, Sikh, Hindu, anything. If I were going to go back to that first question about, things that I thought I knew, that I've had to revise, one of the things I was absolutely clear on growing up is that we understood now that anti-Semitism was wrong, and it was no longer even a thing. And it's been such a shock to me, I'm sure I've said this to y'all before, it's been such a shock to me how that's reared itself up in recent years. I cannot say clearly enough, Jesus would oppose anti-Semitism in any form. And I say this so clearly partly because what Jesus is saying right here isn't just believe this truth of who I am. He's laying out a combination thing, a fourfold thing that includes not just the truth that sets you free, like then you're done, but continuing in Jesus' word and following as his disciples. It's not like he says this to say that what he wants is for us to believe in you, Jesus, and then we can stop wondering ever again about any other truth or any other falsehood. Jesus is very clear there's an ongoing path here of following and continuing. We didn't talk about these other questions like we see in these books about truth and falsehood. Because of where this particular argument has gone, it's not part of the conversation, but I have no doubt if you were standing here with us today, if we started to say to him, Jesus, what about anti-Semitism? What about this history of racism in our nation? What about the ways injustice continues in our midst? Don't you think he'd look at us and say, well, what did I ask of you? Which would send us back to study his word. And what would we find? We'd find things like love, and even with tax collectors and sinners, and we'd find justice, and we'd find healing. Jesus would remind us, he gave you one job, remember? It's one job, two jobs, right? You're going to love God, and we're going to love our neighbor. In John, this gospel that we're in today, was almost always love one another, which is really broad. So what does that look like as we come into the season of Lent? It might mean asking again, what do I need to re-examine that I thought I knew? It might mean wondering, would I be more free if I allowed myself to look? We'll come back around to this question of how it can be freeing to look honestly at the truth as best we can discern it, when wouldn't it be easier just to hide from it all? But whoever said free equals easy? God knows this is not easy work. The work of self-examination and discipline is never going to be easy. And it's been said, the truth will make you free, but first it's going to make you miserable. Which may very well be what we're in for in this season. Lent is always going to be like that, actually, if we're doing it right. Let's do it right, my friends. We've made a beginning just right here in this conversation. And we have a lot of Lent yet to go. Amen.